Hello, awesome humans. My name is Trent Day Hall, and I am a educational consultant. I'm also a facilitator, as well as a presenter around things that literally help us lean into our collective humanity. Today, I am here to go over the Undesign the Redline exhibit with the intention of hopefully giving you a little bit of an understanding as to why this thing is important, and to hopefully entice you, as well as anybody else that you're connected with, to come to the exhibit so that you can have a collective understanding of how we walk through the world so that we can change things for the better. Hello, amazing humans. How are you doing today? So today we are going to be going over something that's pretty awesome, something that actually helps you get an understanding of how we are in today's society the way that we are, specifically around race, culture, and socioeconomic status. And so what we are looking at is an awesome exhibit called Undesign the Redline, which was created by Designing the We. And what this does is essentially break down the things that we need to understand about how our metropolitan cities were created and how race and socioeconomic status was interwoven together. And so we're going to have a couple of panels that we're going to go over, and it's going to be my job to try to give you a quick run through or an understanding of what it is that we're talking about. So hopefully, A, you can gain some information, and maybe you'll join us for a live tour. All right, amazing people. So the first section that we are looking at, section 1, is actually just a general overview of everything that we are going to be going over for our Undesign the Redline tour. And so on this panel, you will see that it essentially gives you a clear definition of what redlining is and what this entire tour is about. And so when we're talking about redlining, unfortunately, what we're talking about is the systematic removal of resources from major metropolitan cities. And this was essentially the response that the North had as the South essentially shifted out a lot of primarily black people because of fear of persecution. And so when we have that time period where there's a lot of transition happening, we have the Great Migration happening, we have a lot of black families moving from the South into the North. Unfortunately, what happened was not necessarily the freedom and the promise that they might have thought. What ended up happening is that we created these maps. And when I say we, you're going to hear me say that a lot. I'm talking about the United States of America. I'm talking about our government. I'm talking about the systems that we created. We essentially created maps where we were going to decide who had the ability to have access to certain resources. The map that you're looking at is a redlining map. These maps were created around the 1930s and lasted till about the around 1968, around the Federal Fair Housing Act. And so as you look at this map, you can see it's pretty color-coded and it looks beautiful, even though it's not necessarily representing beautiful things. And so as we look over these maps, what you'll have an understanding of is there are different areas that are color-coded, and it corresponds to how much resources we are actually going to allow to exist in those spaces. So whenever you see these red areas, that is actually the redlined area. What that means is essentially that there was Negro infiltration. What that means is that if there is literally one family, one black person in this area, it is enough for us to say that it's redlined. And what that means is that we're going to systematically take away resources and that we're not going to put resources into those spaces. The way that it was done is through a lot of different actual mechanisms. And so this is the map that lets you know where to remove and put resources at. But there were also things that were created over time that were specifically meant to systematically remove those resources or shift them to somewhere else. And so we're going to go over this a little bit more in other sections, but we have contract buying, planned shrinkage, speculative investing, deindustrialization, predatory banking, mass incarceration, block busting, and urban renewal. Essentially, these are all mechanisms that were used to make sure that what is being talked about, what is being projected on this map comes to fruition. The reason why this is important for us to talk about is not only because of history, not only for us to really make sure that we're understanding where we came from, but is to also have an understanding of how this correlates to where we are right now, where we are today. Because unfortunately, the United States decided during this time period and a little bit before that we were going to tether socioeconomic status, race, and culture. And what that means is that it's impossible for us to actually move past a lot of the hiccups that we see when we interact as human beings, especially around race and culture, unless we have an opportunity to address these things, unless we have the ability to uncover how this impacts the way that we walk through the world and how we experience things. And so as we're going over this, I really want you to align yourself with the fact that this is just about refinement, becoming better as a nation, becoming better as a community, and not necessarily making people feel guilty. These are realities that exist. In order for us to correct these realities, we must genuinely talk about them. So in the 1930s is when this kind of started. 1938 is when this map is. But the 1930s, essentially what we're doing is we're coming off of slavery, we're coming off of all these things that we were essentially treating black citizens and people of color as secondary, as if they were subhuman. As we're trying to shift and transition and honor what our nation is supposed to be about, a lot of things were created in the interim. A lot of things that were actually meant to kind of replace slavery as a system because it had a purpose. One of those things is Jim Crow. This is essentially where we're making segregationist laws, right? And this is the first step that helped people get into a space to where they wanted to understand who they could and couldn't live with, who they did and didn't want to live with, and how resources were going to be distributed in different areas. And again, I say a lot of people fled the South because of persecution, because of violent persecution. But what they didn't understand and what they didn't know is that they would be moving into a space that would actually be traumatic for another reason, would hinder their growth for other purposes. And so as we go over this, again, this is just a general overview. These maps existed in about 237 cities, metropolitan cities throughout the United States. I want you to think about that. These maps that were created that were meant to systematically help systems and governments remove resources and figure out where resources should go based on race and culture were created for 237 cities in the United States, just about every metropolitan city. And what that means is that whenever you're in the city, similar to the city that's closest to us, Baltimore, and you have an understanding of how things look different in suburban areas, what we're going to be breaking down is why that is. It's not because of the people that live there, because they don't care about their homes. Again, to reiterate, 1938, this is 2000, and we're still dealing with the remnants of this. We've never come back and actually fixed this or remedied it. All we did is acknowledge that it existed. And so for us to make sure that we're moving forward for better generations, we need to spend time on digesting this in order to move forward. Not to make anyone feel sad, not to make anyone feel bad, but genuinely to lean into our own greatness, our collective humanity, if you will. Now, all of these things are things from the past that are important. What you see right here is actually a federal documentation that we're going to get into on Section 2 that actually breaks down how housing and the federal government decided to communicate who was allowed to live where and how resources were going to be dictated. It's really important for us to look at that federal language because it cues you in to essentially why we're at where we're at right now. Now, before we move on from just this general overview, I really want you all to have an understanding, again, of why it's important to talk about today. History is beyond important, but it doesn't matter unless we can really tether it and connect it to where we are today. How does this impact the way that I walk through the world now? On this diagram, you will basically see a couple of different things that it actually affects. And so one of the major things that it affects is the race-wealth gap. So whenever we're talking about resources, whenever we're talking about genuine intergenerational wealth, this system that we're looking at that was created, that permeated for legally for 30 years, even though we're going to see a little bit later that it actually permeated way beyond 1968, the Federal Fair Housing Act. It has had a direct correlation to the way that wealth distribution is experienced in America, primarily for Black Americans. Health, again, the same exact thing. When we're looking at these maps, what you're going to have an understanding of is those redlined areas are in areas that are meant to not be good. They don't have good land, they might have pollutants, and that affects the health of the people that live in those areas. Those things are still here today. There are a lot of ways in which neighborhoods still, unfortunately, are impacted by the fact that highways were built right in the middle of them, that they were built right next to industrial areas where pollutants were present, and that's the only places that they were allowed. And so when we're talking about health and we're talking about the perception of all of this, we have to understand that it's interwoven. It didn't necessarily in 1968. Next, there's predatory banking and wealth extraction. This was very, very prominent around 2008. And since 2008, unfortunately, intergenerational wealth and the wealth of Black Americans has actually been dwindling. The last time I looked, by 2053, I believe that Black Americans will have no wealth. And so there are a lot of things that have been done at this time period and things that have been done more recently that have intentionally meant to keep intergenerational wealth down in the Black community. This is important for us to have an understanding of, because if we want to be great as a nation, we need to make sure that we're supporting and understanding how all of these things affect all of us. It's easy to look at all these things and see that they might just affect people of color. But what I also need you to understand is that socioeconomic status is also a piece of this. It's just easier to determine where people are and to also create things like this when you have a physical manifestation. But when we're talking about the working class that have to live in these areas, they are also unfortunately being affected by the same exact things. Policies and policing. Essentially, in these areas, there are harsher policies that are put in place that are meant to unfortunately exploit people. Policing practices in these red line areas or in these yellow areas are also very different than when you're looking at your suburban areas, your green or your blue areas, areas where they're affluent, where it's seen as we are putting money and injecting money into this because it's the good part of the city. And so as we go over our entire time together, as we go through each panel, what my hope is that you will have an understanding clearly of the history and how it's been broken down, as well as how this correlates to where we are today and why it is important for us to talk about. So, on panel 2, as we shift and move over, we're going to get a little bit more in depth into actually what it is that we're talking about when it comes to redlining and how people were actually describing the things that they needed to the people who were going to be determining how they actually were divvying up resources. And so, again, what I said before when I was talking about us, I was talking about the federal government, essentially codifying this into our policies, our laws, the way that we walk through the world and the American fabric. And so you're going to notice a couple of things here. First and foremost, because of the area that we're in, I feel like it's really important for us to recognize that this map right here is a map of Baltimore City. This is from 1938. And so when we're talking about redlining, 239 metropolitan cities, major cities that were intentionally mapped out to decide how we were going to divvy up resources, and the way that we divvied up those resources were based on ethnicity and race, right? And so then we tethered socioeconomic status to that. Now, for you all, I want you to think about, just take a thought experiment for me. When you think about Baltimore right now, and you think about the different areas in Baltimore, how might redlining fit into that space? And so I'm hoping maybe you take a little pause before I continue, because I am going to give you the answer. And so as we look at this map, just to reiterate, any green areas that you see on this map are first grade. That essentially means that we're going to continue to put resources there. That means that it's a very affluent area and that we're going to continue to invest in it. What it also means is that there are no people of color in that area. What it also means is that it is primarily executive businessmen. Very seldom are there families or working class families in there. Now, when we get to our blue areas, there's a lot more blue areas. That is your second grade. That's where you have more of your working families. You have people that are generally moving from that city area to move for a promise of the suburban aspect. And so something that's also important to note is that suburbia, those spaces that are right outside of the city, were actually created during these times, intentionally, because people were moving out of the city trying to get away from people of color. And so there are a couple of things like speculative investing, which was intentionally done to essentially trick homeowners into selling their homes because they were afraid that black people were moving in. And again, something that we have to understand is it wasn't always correlated to just race or people not liking one another. But what the federal government decided to do, and what we're going to see a little bit right here, especially with this federal underwritten manual, is that property value was tethered to race. And so for a lot of people that lived in the city area, there was the fear as black people moved in because of the Great Migration to try to find a better life, that their property value would inherently go down and that their intergenerational wealth, the things that they were leaving for their family members, would essentially be dwindled. And so you have a lot of people moving in, essentially telling people that they need to move, buying homes at a loss in that city area to the owner, and then selling them properties that were in suburbia, subsidizing suburbia, creating new school systems, new infrastructures that essentially were completely removed and different than the ones that were in the city areas. And so what happened in these city areas, like this redlined area, this is actually Baltimore downtown area. It's called the Black Butterfly. It's called the Black Butterfly for a reason. If you're familiar with Baltimore city area, you might understand that if you go to the harbor, it looks beautiful. You're by the aquarium, you're by all the amazing restaurants. However, if you go 2 to 3 streets over from that, it looks very different infrastructure-wise, the roads, the people, and the types of stores that you see. This is actually telling you why that is. Unfortunately, where we are right now in today's age is that we have not shifted. We never fixed anything. And so this black butterfly, where resources were systematically taken away on purpose, where only people of color were seen as being able to live here because once there's one black family, it's seen as Negro infiltration. This is still the reason why Baltimore City looks the way that it looks and it has the symptoms that it has. Things were intentionally done to cause pain and to cause people to essentially be fighting over resources in that space. Your yellow areas are areas where there are foreign-born individuals. It's very interesting because depending on your ability to pass, depending on your ability to assimilate, whether that be physically or otherwise, depends on your ability to acquire or connect to the American dream. And in this case, it was property value. It was living your best life and being able to have access to resources. And so after a couple of years, what ended up happening in terms of assimilation, Irish, Polish, and Italians were treated in the same exact way as most other foreign-born individuals. However, because of physical manifestations, because it's harder after a couple of generations to tell if someone is a different culture than you because of their skin tone, unless their last name or their language projects them out there, they can essentially pass. They can essentially choose to live in this area or be accepted into the culture very differently than people of color, than primarily black people. And so that's why now when you think about your Baltimore area, this is 1938. Some of these yellow areas are blue areas now, or green areas, like your Little Italy. These are essentially spaces and places that were allowed to, over time, assimilate into the greater culture. Now, when you think about your Little Italy and how it might have looked very similar to your red and yellow areas before, I want you to think about, again, the harbor area. When you think about those spaces right outside of it, it essentially communicates we're still dealing with the same exact things today and that we haven't fixed it. And so as we go over this, I want to make sure that I'm also giving you a clear understanding of how the federal government actually decided to quantify and describe these different areas. And so what you have here are actual copies of federal documentation. And so these are the federal documentations that were used and given to homeowners, to people that were going to be selling property, to people that were thinking about owning or buying property, with the intention of letting them know where they should or shouldn't put their resources. And so if you look, you see the strings are correlating to each area. For A1, which is your green area, I want to read a couple of things so that you can have an understanding of how, again, the federal government decided that they wanted to describe these areas. So these are your green areas. These are your grade A areas, the best area that you could live in. And so when you look at the sheet, it breaks down and gives you the name of the city, the description of the terrain, the favorable influences, the detrimental influences, and then it also breaks down inhabitants and then goes into a couple of other things about history, how much it should cost, if you should rent, so on and so forth. And so for this green area, it's undilated land, the favorable influence, very nice planned residential area, medium to large homes, direct transport to the center of the city is good, and it's close to the business area in Greenmount. So it's a really good area in terms of transition, in terms of being able to have transportation into places that you need. Now, when we break down the inhabitants, this is where we start to get into what are those detrimental influences. So right off the bat, it says there are no detrimental influences for this space. And remember, this is a green area, this area right here. And so the inhabitants, type are executive professionals, mostly men. Estimated family income is over 5,000, which is a lot of money back then. It asks outright, are there foreign-born individuals in that area? And then it asks for a percent. Here it says none. Next line over, completely separate, it asks if there's Negro infiltration, and it asks for the percent, and it says none. As you go down, it talks a little bit more about the buildings and the types that there are, and then also when you get down to the history, the types of sales or rent that you should do. What I want you to have an understanding of is that rent during this time was pretty much created to keep people from being able to own their homes, from being able to have intergenerational wealth. And so even in these areas, these green and blue areas, remember, they're essentially white flight is happening. People are leaving the city for the promise of what's supposed to be in suburbia, mostly white families. And when they're doing that, the intention is to help them own those homes, not to help them rent homes. Because when you rent a home, you're not actually owning anything. You're not having any intergenerational wealth. And so on this sheet, it literally says, do not rent these homes to people, help them buy. Help them buy. Now that's important because I want us to also have an understanding that between 1934 and 1962, the federal government backed $120 billion of loans, and more than 98% of that went to only white homeowners. And so when we're talking about this aspect of helping people own homes, helping people actually lean into intergenerational wealth, there was intentionality not only behind what we were going to be describing to everyday people, locals, and what we wanted them to lean into, but that there was also a systematic example of how we are going to be taking those resources out of these spaces, letting them die, and then putting them somewhere else. $120 billion of something else put into spaces that had pretty much nothing to do with people of color. And this is, again, right after the heels of dealing with Jim Crow, black codes, and all the other things that we had in our history that we're going to see on our timeline that essentially affected America's viewpoint of race and socioeconomic status. Now, I also want to go over, I'm not going to go over the blue area because it's pretty much the same, just a little bit less, but what I do want to do is go for the area that is seen as most advantageous, and then the two areas that are seen as, honestly, they call them sick. They call them dying parts of cities. And so what we're going to talk about right now is actually this part of the black butterfly. Again, the black butterfly is that area that's right outside the harbor, right? And once upon a time, it was actually seen as only being able to be industrial spaces in the center, but now condos are moving in because of gentrification. It's a completely different thing. But what I'm talking about right now is D1, one part of the black butterfly. And again, this is a redlined area. And I want you to really pay attention to how this description is different than the description I just went over of the area. And so again, they're going to give you the name of the area. They're going to give you the description of the terrain, the favorable influences, the detrimental influences, and then also the inhabitants, as well as breaking that down a little bit. And so on this form, the favorable influences, good transportation, and it's a central location. So it's right in the middle of the city. Awesome place, right? Now, when we get to detrimental influences, it says automatically there is a Negro concentration and that there is executive ground rents in many of the areas. And so there are two things I want to break down. Negro concentration, again, if there is literally one black person or one black family in an area, it was enough to be considered Negro infiltration, enough to be considered a redlined area, enough to make sure that we are systematically removing resources and that we're not putting resources back. This includes schools, this includes garbage, this includes literally anything that's a social service that you essentially would need that the city or people are supposed to provide for you. And so that Negro concentration is enough to make this as a redlined area where we're going to start to remove some of those resources. Not only that, but when we're talking about excessive ground rent. So ground rent essentially means that you can own the home, but you do not own the property. And so a lot of times people would have ownership of their home, but they had to continually pay ground rent for the area that they live on, and they never truly owned their home. And so what ended up happening, even if you have a home, essentially you lose it. And the reason why it's telling you that this is a detrimental influence is because that you can never own your home even if it's on one of these spaces. Do you see how it's important? They're trying to make sure that we're creating, again, the structures to decide who is going to have what. These areas where you cannot actually own your property are good enough for people of color, and particularly black people. But we do not want our suburban families, our families that were in these areas, our white families, to actually have to deal with that same dynamic, all right? When we get down to the types of inhabitants, this is when it's breaking down the actual population. And so the first thing it says is that there is a mixture of different types of people in this area, that the estimated family income is about $1,000 in comparison to over $5,000 for the other one. Again, it asks about the foreign-born population. It says that there is a mixture and that there is about 15% of foreign-born individuals in this area. Next line, it just asks simply, are there Negroes? The answer is yes. And then it asks for a percent, and it says 80%. 80% in this area. Asks if the population is increasing, and it asks also if the population is decreasing. And essentially here it says that the population is decreasing fast because this is, again, where we had that white flight movement happening. People shifting to the outskirts. This is where you have the creation of like your Catonsvilles and your other areas that are more of your suburban places. And so, again, I'm hoping that you all get a chance to come and actually see this for yourself, to read and break this down. But it's also really important to show that when they're talking about the sales and rent, that there is literally an extensive description of how you should rent this out to people. Reason being, again, is because during this time, rent was created to not essentially help people have intergenerational wealth, to be able to pass things on, but to keep them in one space. That same concept of ground rent where you're not able to own your home is the same concept of being able to simply rent a home in general, where you don't actually have ownership of it, where you're not actually passing on intergenerational wealth, and your money feels like it's actually going into a black hole in a lot of ways. And so when we're talking about all of these things, we're talking about a map from 1938. However, if you overlaid socioeconomic status, breakdown of race, all the things that this is showing you for today's map, besides those gentrified areas which have been intentionally shifted, you would see the same exact picture. The reason why you would see the same exact picture, again, and I'm going to continue to reiterate this, is that as a nation, we have never done anything to actually remedy or correct this. We've pointed it out. We've changed rules by the Federal Fair Housing Act, but we never retroactively went back and did anything for all of the years in which all of these things were done and perpetuated on specific groups of people that hindered their ability to lean into the American dream. I want to leave us with one thing before we move from this panel. And again, I really hope that you all come and actually get a chance to read this, because as you can see, there's a lot of dense material on here. There is no way, even if I had 1 billion hours, that I could break down all of this, because there is so much that is contextual, connected to your own story or your family story, as well as having an understanding of the actual vocabulary. But one thing I want to read, and this is from the Federal Underwritten Manual. So the Federal Underwritten Manual, it was a manual that was created by the federal government and given to lenders, given to owners and buyers, for them to have an understanding of how they wanted to communicate to people of color, to anyone else, the types of things that they should sell, property value. And so there's something that I want to read that basically breaks down a good example of how people created logic around this, how they justified being able to have mistreatment towards people or not allow people to have the same exact resources that they have, just simply based off skin color or culture. The colored people certainly have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but they must recognize the economic disturbance which their presence in a white neighborhood causes and forgo their desire to split off from the established district where the rest of their race lives. And so to break that down in layman's terms, essentially what this is saying is that, look, it's not that we don't want black people to live in our areas or that we don't like black people, but what they need to understand is that inherently, if they live in the same areas as us, they will make our property value go down. They will make my home less valuable. And during this time, this is during us coming off the Great Depression, reeling back, a lot of people were essentially trying to make sure that they had a foundation. That foundation of intergenerational wealth is with their home. If your home property or the property of your home is threatened, the value of it, just by simply people moving in, the logic that happens for people is that you're not going to really critically think about the humanity behind it. You're going to be trying to do what you need to do for your family. And so things like this that were written in that underwritten manual gave actual language for people to say, this has nothing to do with me minimizing your humanity, but what you need to understand is that inherently, if you are a black person and you live in my neighborhood, then that means that you're going to bring down property value. Not understanding that all of this was created and essentially like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so it's not inherent that property value goes down when black people move into those spaces. However, it was created in this space to make sure that we're creating suburbia, these green and blue areas, and that we're also centralizing foreign-born individuals and black people in one area. And then we're systematically taking resources away. It's really interesting because a lot of times I think we think about the South being the bad guy when it comes to race politics. But this is the ugly truth of how the North, the Union, essentially interacted with the influx of people of color, with the influx of foreign-born individuals. Wasn't necessarily violent persecution in all spaces. There were a couple, and we'll talk about that on the timeline. But what we're talking about is this economic persecution, where we're not allowing people to actually lean into that American dream that they were promised. On our third panel, this is actually where we're going to be breaking down the timeline. And as you can see, there's actually two different timelines on this panel. And so the timeline goes from 1800 till today. The top half are the government responses, the things that our federal government did, local governments did in order to interact with race, culture, and ethnicity as it became a booming issue and started to transition, especially after slavery in the United States. The things that you see on the bottom are the grassroots things that citizens did to counteract the things that did not work that the federal government did. So there are a couple of overview things that I really want to tell you about these different timelines. And so when we're looking at this governmental timeline, there's a lot of different arrows, things pointing everywhere. Each section represents like a different time period. So you have your 1800s to 1930s, 1930 to 1960, 1960 to 1990, 1990 till today. And what's important for us to look at as segmented sections is essentially it breaks down how we got from place to place to place. And so we started off as a nation having slaves, enslaved peoples that were primarily African American descent, right? And so as we transition and we move into getting rid of that, which is also interesting for us to talk about, because the Civil War happened not necessarily because we wanted to make sure that people were all treated equally. The North and the South were actually trying to make sure that one or the other didn't secede from the other. And so it was all about an economic driver. And so the Civil War happened. One of the byproducts of that is that black people were now seen as or treated as equal, right? Or seen as a human being. However, this was a huge, huge economic driver for the United States. Slavery was a huge economic driver. And so now we're not doing that anymore. And even right after slavery, it still continued to happen in a lot of different spaces. People still continue to use different variations of it. And that's what you actually have in this panel. You have different variations where we're going to kind of be shifting what we had before as slave labor into other things. So this is where you actually have indentured servitude. You have sharecropping, which is essentially the same thing, especially because there was just a time period where people were just made free and they didn't have anything that was set up for them. They couldn't read, they weren't allowed to read, they're just free. So what happens at that point? What the United States government decided to do is to shift people of color into different categories, into different spaces. So you have Jim Crow, you have the scientific dynamic of how we're going to be saying that even though people of color and black people are not enslaved anymore, that they're less than. They're still subhuman to some extent. Again, we're moving into all these different things where we have segregation, sharecropping, and different aspects that are essentially creating a violent narrative of how we're going to be treating people of color, almost like a backlash from what happened. As a result of that, you have a lot of people of color, primarily black people, deciding that they're going to leave the South. You have things like sundown towns that are created. And unfortunately, those are things that were very similar to stuff we have here as well. Unfortunately, people, I think, forget that Maryland is the South. When we have the Great Migration, this is essentially where you have millions of people fleeing the South in order to find a better life, moving to the North into those major cities. Again, as soon as this happens, this is why we get the creation of that redlining concept, because of Great Migration. Now, what ended up happening during some of those spaces where you would have black families moving in is that some towns actually became sundown towns. And what a sundown town is, essentially, you are allowed, if you are a person of color, to work there during the day. You're not allowed to live there. And if we see you at night, essentially at sundown, you can be lynched or killed or chased out of town. And so there are a lot of towns that essentially decided that this is going to be how they handled that black influx, right? Actually, there was a sundown town, I believe that Savage was a sundown town at one point, Savage Mills, which is close in this area. But there are a couple of areas in Maryland, close to Baltimore, that were sundown towns. Essentially areas where you were allowed to work if you were a person of color, but you cannot live. And if you were caught there at night, something bad would happen to you. And so as we're thinking about this dynamic in that first section from 1930, right, this is right before we start to create those redlining maps where we're going to be taking away and making sure that we have an understanding of what resources we want to put into areas where there are people of color. So as we move on to the second era, this is actually where you have that creation of redlining. Now, redlining spawned a lot of different things that unfortunately destroyed the black community, destroyed the working class community, as well as any other foreign individuals that were not able or not willing to assimilate. And what I mean by assimilate is essentially adopting white American Protestant culture. So maybe you had to change your last name if you had an Irish last name. Maybe you had to decide that you weren't going to be a practicing Catholic. You're essentially getting rid of some of your culture in order for you to exist in this space and not be affected by what it is that we're talking about when it's redlining. So it still is a dehumanizing factor. And so once we have the New Deal happening, World War II, essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to get past the Great Depression. We're trying to make sure that we're subsidizing and creating new opportunities for families to live. And so the GI Bill after World War II was a really good example of that, where if you fought, you basically would come back and you would be given a home no matter what, right? There are a whole bunch of different things that happened that basically didn't make this equal based on your race or based on your cultural status, your ethnicity. And so when we're talking about subsidizing suburbia, I talked a bit about this before, white flight. You intentionally have families being pushed or moved by speculative investors outside of these city areas, so all the resources, the tax money, the things that they would bring that would make sure that these areas wouldn't die are now being shifted somewhere else. Not only that, but if they sold their home, they sold it for a loss, and then the person who bought it from them is exploiting them because then they're selling it, or they're renting it or selling it for an absurd amount of money to people of color. Now, what's also really important is when we're talking about these things that should have been universal, like during World War II, a lot of black men fought in World War II. A lot of black men should have got the promise of the GI Bill, which would have helped in this intergenerational wealth dynamic that we're talking about, regardless of redlining and all this other stuff happening. Unfortunately, when we're talking about race and racism and how the cultural aspects of all these things that we're talking about permeate into how people socialize, how people see one another. And so what you have happening is that people are starting to actually lean in and believe that if you're black or if you're white, you're different, right? And if you're black, you're less than. And so you have a lot of people during that GI Bill that are just deciding not to honor it, regardless of what is being said. Unfortunately, that happened way more frequently than it should, which caused a huge upheaval and a hindrance in black home ownership, which again is directly correlated to intergenerational wealth because that's how America decided to tether it, especially during this time of the Great Migration, or I'm sorry, of the Great Depression. And so a couple of things happen as we're starting to realize the effects of this, the effects of not allowing people of color to have homes. And so what starts popping up are different versions of how we are going to condense these communities into one community. So before we had redlining, maybe we're making sure that they're all in the redlined areas in the cities, we're systematically taking resources away. During this time period is actually where we're creating slums, and we have this concept of urban renewal. This is essentially where we're creating that Section 8 housing, the projects and stuff that we can all think of that have a very bad taste in our mouth and then also don't seem to have the resources that they need. They were created during this time, a lot of times high rises, in order for them to systematically keep all people of color in one place where they knew where they were at. More concepts that connect to this, that's essentially displaced people. So again, you have places being built primarily in areas where there are pollutants, where there is going to be something that is going to be systematically splitting this community up or keeping it away from the suburban areas. And so that's where you have the intentionality of like slum clearances as well, where after a certain period of time, if something has basically been dying for so long because of the lack of resources, because of their no ability for people to lean into what they need to, we're now going to destroy those areas. And so again, that's what led to displacement. People constantly being shifted because they don't have a home for their entire family, but they are shifted from Section 8 housing or from apartment to apartment during this time where it's being created intentionally to keep them in that space. As we move into the era 3, this is 1960 to 1990, this is actually where we start to see a lot of the side effects of this. However, what ends up happening is that the black community gets blamed for them. So this is around the time where you start to see epidemics of drugs and of different diseases. So this is where you have the influx of the crack epidemic, violence epidemic, heroin, as well as HIV and AIDS. And this ravaged the black community where there was intentionality around keeping people in this one area, making sure that they did not have the resources that they need. So this is where you have urban decay, capital flight, which essentially is all the people who would essentially be feeding money into these areas, stores, business owners, are now leaving as a result of everything that was done here that has created these living areas to be undesirable. There's no resources. There's no reason why we would be in that. Not only that, but as a result of continually taking away resources for about 30 to 40 years, people are now fighting over scraps. As a result of that, you have the violent epidemic. As we were talking about before, since we're taking away those resources, part of that are clinics and health benefits, being able to understand what it is that you need health-wise. And so as the HIV and AIDS pandemic came on and we didn't have any idea what it was, what you also have is this ravaging through, not only because of drug use and because of what was done in this area, but also because people don't have the direct or correct amount of health care. And that was intentionally done in certain spaces to not provide them with what they need. We can continue to break down all these different things. There's literally multiple different facets of how things were intentionally done over time that were seen as remedies to the things before it, but actually didn't help at all. They usually caused more problems, or there wasn't enough critical thought behind it for them to understand how it was going to affect people in the long run. Now, as a result, we have an unraveling of social fabric. All these different things, all these different pandemics, on top of all of the long-lasting history and the lack of resources that you have for a lot of black communities, is going to have an effect. When we move to the 1990s, what that effect has not only on black people, but the view of black people is that we're criminalized, that we're less than. All those issues and things that were created intentionally are now seen as things that are inherently black issues, that are inherently people of color issues, that just inherently exist in their community. However, as we can see from 1990s till today, the war on drugs was intentionally done to keep the persecution on black people, to keep them in those spaces. The way that we went back and reinvested in areas after black families were deinvested is something called gentrification. This is essentially people getting those areas that are more desirable, and after a period of time,
They didn't want to live with people of color. They didn't want to live with black people. And so when that great migration happens, you have people living in those areas, you make the area essentially get so rotten from the inside that it now has to be destroyed and shifted. And once that happens, it's a lot cheaper. You can come in and gentrify the area or create things that the people who usually lived in those areas will no longer have the ability to have access to. And so there are a couple of places in Baltimore that you can actually see that are very similar to that, where once upon a time they looked very different, and over the last 7 to 8 years, they've transitioned and shifted. A lot of students have moved into the areas. The infrastructure is different. The police patrol a lot more. Just essentially different. And these things are done maybe not with one person masterminding and thinking that they're intentionally trying to harm people, but there's intentionality behind how we're moving this way. Not only that, but we're unintentionally causing consequences that I think a lot of people don't understand and are rubbing up against, especially when we're talking about interacting with people around different races, around different cultures. You have foreclosures, you have mass incarceration, which again is important because it's directly correlating back to us trying to find a way, and I say us as the American government, a way to replace slavery. Slavery made a lot of money. And so mass incarceration is the easiest way for us to have legal slavery. Now, mass incarceration is on here because there was intentionality behind targeting areas where black males and black people lived to essentially reinvigorate that slave labor, which caused a direct correlation to a lot of different hurt and pain within different communities, caused a lot of trauma. So what's important also for us to understand where we're at now, I think we've probably transitioned a little bit away from this, but there's a lot of us reinvesting in understanding how police brutality fits into this. Reinvesting into understanding how we can combat things so that we do not fall into the same traps, right? And so, whereas all of these things at the top are the governmental responses that they did in order to try to remedy slavery or shift it or transition, everything that you see at the bottom of the timeline are things that citizens and regular community members did in order to counteract the things that happen from the federal government dynamic. And so something that's also really important to note is that nothing on this top line actually was beneficial if it wasn't for people literally leaning in and holding accountable. And so the federal government a lot of times didn't necessarily have an understanding of what the black community actually need. They prescribed things. But when you have this grassroots dynamic at the bottom, these are essentially the citizens that are a part of what it is that they're experiencing, deciding how they want to move forward and how they want to combat some of the things that are on there. So you have things like the civil rights movement, you have things like abolitionists, you have Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ, globalization, a lot of different movements, grassroots movements that were meant to be direct counteractions to the things that you see on this timeline. Now, I'm going to end with talking about some lessons. As I've said on every other panel, as you can see, this is a lot of information. There is no way that I can essentially break down all of how important this is. What I'm hoping is that you get an understanding of generally what this is communicating, and that you actually get a chance to come here and read some of these smaller paragraphs to get a greater understanding of capital flight, to get a greater understanding of urban decay and how it correlates to where we are right now. And so to end, I want to talk about the lessons that we're supposed to be taking from this panel right here. So lesson number 1, almost all of the policies cited here as detrimental were proposed as solutions to other problems. So again, that top half, this is the federal government essentially seeing how we can move and transition from slavery to try to make things better. But unfortunately, because it wasn't done from a human aspect, and it was more done from a resource base or actually making sure that we're getting back on track with the economics that came from slavery, a lot of these things actually just ended up causing more problems, caused more harm than was actually meant. Lesson 2, almost all of the practices cited here as detrimental were either exploiting or taking advantage of racial and class inequality for financial gain. So it's essentially just what I said, Remember, we're tethering, unfortunately, race and socioeconomic status, which are going to also determine what your ability is in order to have resources. And it makes it easier for people to be split up in terms of not interacting. Lesson 3, almost all the detrimental effects of these policies and practices were meant to, or felt unequally on minorities and the poor, and contributed to the renewed and perpetual marginalization. And so what this essentially does, if we have systems where the federal government is telling you how you need to be selling your property, how you need to be mindful of where you live, what happens from a social standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, is that now we actually are starting to lean into this belief that people are less than based on their color. And so all of these different things essentially led us to the space where we can't really interact with our full humanity. We see each other through colors, we see each other through socioeconomic status, because the fabric of our nation was actually created on that. Our foundations were created on that. So it's important for us to have that awareness so that we don't fall into those traps. Lesson 4, almost all of the economic models cited here attempted to address both racial and economic inequality. And as you can see, it's still something that we're dealing with. So what that means is that this is a complex, multifaceted, very nuanced issue. A lot of times when we're talking about all of this, especially when we're talking about trying to interact with people or trying to make sure that racism is dead, these things are very, very complex. So it's not just a one and done. You can't just come to this exhibit, have all of this information, and then figure out what to do next. If that was the case all of these years, I'm sure someone would have figured it out. The reason why this is such a complex issue is because we're all different people. We all walk through the world differently. And again, there is nuance behind how your identity impacts you. Yes, your race and how you walk through the world is one thing. Socioeconomic status is another thing, but there are so many different layers and levels to how we actually experience ourselves and how other people experience us, that this dumbed down version of just looking at people as colors makes it very easy for us not to want to lean in and understand one another, for us to truly socialize and connect, which would actually be the remedy for a lot of this if we genuinely connected, we genuinely understood one another. The fifth one, so significant social change has come through people-driven movements and never began from top-down forces. So again, that is all these grassroots movements. So these grassroots movements, when we're talking about humanity, when we're talking about actually moving, when we're talking about things like the civil rights movement, didn't happen because of the federal government. They weren't successful because of the federal government. They were successful because people truly leaned in to how they wanted to honor their collective humanity. They recognized that the mistreatment of certain groups or certain cohorts is not what they want. And as a result, people have created things to combat what we saw at the top, and have created things in order to make sure and maintain their own humanity as well as other people's humanity. And the sixth lesson, there seems to be a pattern of qualitative differences between bottom-up, self-funded movements and philanthropical-driven movements. And so what that essentially means is that right now there are a lot of organizations that are being created with the intention of actually creating or combating a lot of this. A lot of them are philanthropical, sorry, that word gives me trouble, where the intention is to actually help people. It's not for profit. It's not for anything other than leaning into our collective humanity and trying to make us better as people. And so what we're starting to see as a result of these grassroots movements is that people are actually coming together, grouping up, creating organizations that as a collective are trying to tackle some of these issues. And so what I'd suggest for you all is, if there are groups that you know of that you can be a part of, people that are like-minded where you want to essentially lean into things that can help combat some of the symptoms of these, it's really important for you to truly, truly lean in. And this exhibit can give you a good example as to how people created things like that. Now, on another panel, we're gonna actually get a chance to see some solutions, but it's really important for me to say this, and I'm gonna mention it on the other panel, is that it is impossible for us to think of a one-time, one-done-all solution. It's important for us to critically think about the way that we walk through the world, the environments that we're in, and then actually making sure that we're not prescribing any community that we're in things that are not going to work with them. We need to be of the community and actually lean into it.
On this panel, this is panel 4, I'm not going to really be going over a large portion of this piece of the panel, which kind of breaks down a little bit of very similar to the timeline, just more specific stories. Definitely encourage you to come look at these. But what I primarily want to focus on is actually connected to where we're at right now. So right now we are in Colombia, and Colombia was actually created to be the antithesis of everything that we just talked about today. So Jim Rouse essentially created Colombia to make sure that people of different cultures, socioeconomic statuses could live and thrive in the same exact place. Beautiful, beautiful dream, beautiful mission. And for a long time, I think that it genuinely held true and leaned into those principles. Now, it's important for us to make sure that we have a clear understanding as to where we are right now and the reality of the situation. So again, just like I've said before, this is not about necessarily bad-mouthing or saying if anything is bad, but there's always the ability for us to refine and to get better and to have awareness of, right? And so when we're talking about this gentleman, Jim Rouse, who essentially created this space based on the things that he experienced in his life. He wanted to make sure that he created a space where everyone felt welcome, where your race or your religion or your socioeconomic status did not determine who you had the ability to connect with, where you had the ability to live. And so Colombia was created with these 4 goals in mind: to build a complete city that meet the basic needs of its people, to respect the land, to provide for the growth of people, and to make a profit. Again, with the underpinning of this is going to be the antithesis of some of these redline cities that we're seeing, where things are systematically put into place and people are segregated. And so this went really well. This is an amazing space in terms of cultural fusions, in terms of people interacting. However, what's really important for us to really understand and lean into is that a mission, a dream, as amazing, as complex as this, is not something that's just going to perpetually continue. It needs to be mined. It needs to be workshopped. We need to lean into it. And so what I want us to think about as I'm going over this is how much we're actually leaning into that as a community, as individuals, or from an institutional standpoint, as a county, where we're really holding true to what Colombia is supposed to be. And the reason why I say that is because if we look at this breakdown or map, actually, it basically gives you a rough idea of demographics, of the different types of people that have lived in this area and how migration has actually happened in the county. And so right here we have 1980, right here we have 2010, so about 10 years ago, right? And what you start to notice, and it breaks down the colors, is that there is pretty much an even distribution of where people are living at, right? There's not a concentration of one race or one culture in one area. They're pretty much sprinkled everywhere, centralized in the city. Now, as we move 10 years later, you can start to actually see that that centralized area is starting to permeate a little bit more out. What's ending up happening is that you're starting to see the blue dots, which are white people, actually start to leave that center area of Colombia, that city. So it's very similar to what we were seeing and what I was describing on that on the redlining maps, which is essentially white flight, right? So like what's happening that's causing that? Not only that, but then you see these centralized locations in the middle, which are where the places where there was a lot of different types of cultures. You see some of those being pretty much all black areas or all one cultural area. And again, I ask, what's behind that? Why does that happen, right? And so what we need to really think about are the different dynamics that make up self-segregation, that make up why people live where they live, right? And so a lot of it has to do with where you're able to live. So affordable housing. Once upon a time when Colombia was created, at its inception, you could have $1 million homes right next to apartments. And maybe they're even sharing mailboxes. However, now when we're talking about the development of Colombia and how we're actually creating this metropolitan area, it is very intentional in terms of where you see certain people live. So areas like your Oakland Mills, areas like your Long Reach are very different than areas that are outside of Colombia
like your Glenelg or your River Hill. And the reason why I'm pointing that out, and this map highlights that, is because what can be seen as self-segregation, but what we really need to understand is that the aspect of resources, where affordable housing is put, and how we are communicating or interacting with our neighbors, all affects the ways in which people decide to live and where they decide to live. And so what I'm suggesting is that this is not a natural progression. That we didn't move from people all being in one area mixed up to people self-segregating because of their own factors. However, the way in which we have affordable housing, the way in which our schools are placed, and the ways in which we interact with people based on who they are has an effect on why Columbia is actually the way that it is. And so a perfect example for us to have an understanding of how we can break this down, I want us to think about redistricting with schools. Now, I'm not going to say much about it because I know it's super political, but I really genuinely want you to think about the way that it was interacted with, the ways in which people talked about the students that were going to be moving or shifting into places. A lot of that language is dog whistle language. It might not be intentional, but what is communicating is essentially things that are very similar to what we experienced on that timeline, things that are very similar to what we see on this redlining map, and it's all directly correlated because we can't untether it to race and socioeconomic status. And so when we're talking about students being shifted into areas because essentially maybe they need better access to resources because the area that they're in, the school that they're in, might not fit within those confines, what happens if we're pushing back against that if we're living in those areas? Not necessarily understanding how race and cultural status and socioeconomic status is all tethered to all of those different components. The reason why I'm highlighting the school is because it's really easy for us to think about the innocence of kids. However, even with us thinking about the innocence of kids, something as simple as them trying to get a better education, there are all these different aspects and nuances that seem to fit into the of race, socioeconomic status, and how we are going to be living within our county and how we interact with one another. And so it's important for us to think about these things because these are actual tangible results. It's really important to also have an understanding of somewhere that was created to be the antithesis, literally the opposite of what we've experienced for the most part for American history has still happened. It's still arrived in this space. Reason being is because we need to really lean in and look at this. We need to look at the way that we interact. We need to look at the way that we distribute resources. And we need to really honestly have an honest conversations with ourselves, with the community, and with institutions on what it is that we actually want to be. Are we still sticking to truly what that Columbia notion is in terms of Columbia? And if we are, what are the ways in which we're not serving that? What are the ways in which we're not honoring what Jim Rouse wanted us to do in the beginning? And so there are a lot of ways in which you can start to deconstruct this. You can start to look at even infrastructure. Maybe not to the degree that you see in Baltimore City, but I want you to think about your Long Reach or your Oakland Mills and how that area and how the stores and the perception and even the schools are looked at differently than other parts of Columbia or even other parts of Howard County from a larger aspect. Being able to do those thought exercises will highlight a lot of these aspects that are not supposed to be happening here, that are remnants of this history. This history is essentially permeates all of American history. So although we wanted to create something that was the antithesis of it, these are the foundations that our country was created on. In order for us to truly get to a place that's different than this, we have to continue to synthesize different answers, continue to confront things that might be uncomfortable, and to not put Band-Aids on broken limbs. And so I'm hoping that you come and you take more time to really deconstruct what these maps actually mean. If you live in Columbia, to take some time to think about what this means for your perception of how you walk through the world and how you interact with your neighbors, and then also what things you want to support. Because this has a direct correlation not only to Columbia, but the entire county, as well as all of us interacting with one another. This is our last panel, and so this panel, you might have noticed there have been a couple of times where I've been mentioning things that we can do as a collective, things that we should be doing as a collective in order to combat a lot of the things that we're seeing. And so a lot of times what we've just went over isn't necessarily because people have malicious intent. There is some possible malicious intent behind it, but this is more so because people have no idea, lack of awareness of what's happening and the lack of ability to articulate what's happening so that they can figure out how to critically think about it. And so what this panel does, after you've had the ability to critically think about everything that we've talked about, have a better understanding of how maybe you fit into this space as well as your family, now what we want to do is refocus our energy on how do we actually reframe, refine, change the dynamic that we've been experiencing so that we can experience something different, so that we can create a better lived experience. And so there are a couple of things I mentioned, but what we want to do is be a little bit more deliberate about that. And what I also want to communicate is that these are not one-time solutions, right? And so some of these things may work for you, some of these things may not work for you, but all of them need to be continually engaged in. This isn't just something that you can do that's going to fix or remedy an issue. If it was, all the issues that we've seen, all the amazing people that have come through history that have probably been thinking about things like this, that have critically analyzed this, would have probably solved this issue already. The reason why it's so complex is because there are microcosms of communities. And so Columbia is different than Baltimore, although we still interact with the foundations of the same dynamics that we just talked about. And so in order for us to make sure that within our environments, within our communities, we're really leaning in to all of our collective humanity, there are different things that we need to be mindful of. In order to combat some of these things, there's actually a lot of different ways that you can go. You can go from the personal, you can go from the cultural, or you can go from like the institutional. So a personal dynamic would actually be something very similar to you doing this tour, deciding to take your time to learn more about this information so that you could have awareness, right? So now you have shared language, you have an experience, and you have the ability to articulate some of the issues or some of the things that you might have been feeling in your life that you never had the language for, right? Now, from a cultural standpoint, maybe there is a group of like-minded individuals recognizing that there are a couple of things culturally that you would like to experience with one another, or that you would like to open up to make more people maybe in a neighborhood or a community feel like they belong, like they're included. There are ways in which you can create affinity groups, neighborhood groups that are specifically meant to tackle certain things. And it's not only just creating those groups, but what is your vision? What is your mission? What is your purpose? How much intentionality is put behind the group, the organization of the group, and how you want to move forward? We have examples of a couple of things here. And when you have those neighborhood groups or those affinity groups, you have the ability to have different thought processes, different lived experiences, so that you're not creating a prescribed solution, but that the solutions that you're coming up with, the engagements that you're coming up with, are informed by multiple different personalities, identities that make up this community. Now, when we're talking about institutional, the thing that I want to focus on, or what I would like to say, and by no means are these the only ones, but I wanted to give a couple of just really clear, salient examples. What would it mean for Columbia and Howard County to move back into the space of affordable housing, figuring out how we could recalibrate getting people in spaces where different socioeconomic status and different cultures actually create communities together and exist together? And so what does it look like for us to go back and revisit contracts that are being made, making sure that if we are creating spaces and building new housing that is in this area, who actually has access to that housing? And not only that, when we're talking about who has access from a socioeconomic standpoint, what does that correlate to in terms of culture? There are things that are low-hanging fruit, and there are things that are very complex issues that you can come up with projects. But the intention is for us to actually make sure that, A, we need to have some awareness. A, you need to understand that this is a process. We're talking about going slow to go far. We're not talking about learning this information and then instantly figuring out what to do. I need to do something. I need to do something. We all have that feeling. But we all need to be also mindful of what is our knowledge base. And so if you're going over this and the first thing that you're thinking about are things that you can do, we actually have an amazing group of books right here that actually give solutions, that have talked about this dynamic and break this down from multiple different facets. And so there are people that have come before us who have thought about these solutions. However, they need to be continued. They need to make sure that we lean into them more. They're not just one-stop things. And so I want to read the last thing are a couple of lies that redlining taught me. And the reason why I'm reading this is these are essentially the red flags that can cue you into what are some of the truths that we could lean into. Figuring out the truths that we could lean into will also give you a better understanding of how we can reframe this dynamic, how we can essentially shift and change what we've been experiencing thus far. So the first one, to have confidence that we can be separated, we are not interconnected, and they're the other. So essentially, the lie that this tells you is that we're all different and we all have no desire or need to actually connect or be together. It's false. We make each other better based on our cultural influences, even when we're different. Steel sharpens steel, essentially. Another lie that's pointed out, to rank others' humanity as less than. So there are multiple different ways that we were essentially saying that people are valued based on their race, based on their culture, based on their ethnic status, or their socioeconomic status. What this also needs to point out to you is that it's a lie. We're all essentially human. The ways in which these things affect us might affect certain demographics or certain groups more, but it undermines all of our humanity. And so us leaning into this concept of thinking that some people are just inherently less than actually minimizes your own humanity. Next, to assume less than people have no value, which again is connecting it back to this idea that we can place value for people. Something that this should highlight to you is the concept of dignity, right? And although there are a lot of dignity violations, and what I mean by that is your inherent worth, your sense of desire, your dreams, your aspirations, the sublimation of who you are as a person. There are a lot of ways in which policies, practices, and even maps, entire maps were created to tell someone that they were less than, that they were not equal, that their dignity didn't matter, that it was violated. However, what this is pointing out is that dignity is inherent. All of us have inherent human worth, regardless of who you are, and there are ways in which we can highlight that. A lot of things that we saw on here are ways that are undermining it. To celebrate that some people are better than those others and therefore believe they should dominate, So again, this is this idea of believing that we're over someone. We all have strengths and weaknesses, and depending on the space that you're in and the perspective that you're taking on, it really doesn't mean that anyone is better or worse than anyone else. To fear that if they have more, I will have less. This is very, very important. I think this directly actually connects to that idea that I was bringing up around redistricting as well. And so a lot of times people think about what is going to be lost when they're in that space, not recognizing that there is something that's gained, and also recognizing that you're essentially helping your entire community, not just necessarily thinking about your own child or just yourself, the selfish aspect. And so the fear of essentially thinking that if my kid gets shifted to this school because of redistricting is going to have less access to resources, take longer of a bus ride, not thinking about what the inverse is. Your child now has the ability to interact with a plethora of different people that they never have before, which is going to make them a more well-rounded person. They also have the ability to interact with different cultures, which makes sure that they won't undermine their own humanity. And these are different things that you cannot get in school, socioeconomic status, or social-emotional learning pieces. Not only that, but what's happening for the people that might not have had access to those resources before is now they're actually getting what they need. They're getting access, true access. And so us really needing to understand these three concepts, as well as if we're helping someone out in that genuine way, it's not meaning that we're having less. It's not what equity is about. to have contempt and fear for less than others, and also feel that those with less deserve less. So it's again reinforcing this idea that if you're inherently less than, then that has nothing to do with me and I need to treat you as such. When in actuality, what this has shown us that foundationally those realities and those thought processes have been continually strengthened and aren't necessarily real. This is not real and how it hinders our ability to connect with one another. To somehow think I deserve it. And it's more so thinking that you deserve it over another person. We all deserve to have to ask who I am better than rather than who am I valued by. So again, that aspect of thinking that we are better than, have higher value, or interacting with value. 9, to neither listen nor seek out understanding and knowledge. So this is essentially just putting your head in the sand and choosing to be ignorant on all of these issues that it is that we're talking about. If you watch this video, now you have certain understanding that there is complexities behind this that you might need to dive into. I can't make you do that. I can't make you change the way that you walk through the world, or at least examine the way that you walk through the world. But hopefully you understand that this exhibit can highlight something that you don't know, an unknown, so that you're not walking through the world unintentionally causing harm to yourself or other people. To neither listen nor seek out understanding and knowledge, which is essentially you deciding, again, that you're not going to reach out and understand things, and to be afraid of what you look into or what you look at. And so that's essentially afraid of who you are and how you walk through the world. And so these are things that we can do from a baseline, have an understanding of what lies this highlighted, those red flags, so that we could start to lean into the ways in which we want to recreate, reinvest our resources, our lived experience, and our humanity. All right, everyone. And so as we end our time together, what I really want us to walk away with is having an understanding of how this exhibit gives you awareness of the unknown unknowns, the things that we don't know. And so if we aren't taking the opportunity to lean into things like this, to have an understanding of our collective knowledge, it's impossible for us to honor our collective humanity. And so I end by saying, I hope you feel that this kind of gave you a trailer so that you can come to this exhibit and view things for yourself, take a more close look at them, as opposed to just thinking that I went through this. As I've said before, there is no way that I can break down everything that's on here, and it is beyond important for you to have your own understanding of how this connects to your world and how it might affect the way that you walk through the world. If we don't actually take the time to truly understand concepts like this, it's impossible for us to live in our collective humanity. And so I'm hoping that you take this opportunity to not only lean into this, look into more things, but to also examine some of the ways in which maybe you walk through the world where you can start to assign value differently to yourself and to other people, to honor our collective humanity and honor our dignity. Thank you.